we're going to start with the first question, which is, what did you want to do? What did you want to be when you were younger? So just, studying your educational career, and how did you go from that to who you are today?
It's my favorite question. Because when I started, I didn't really know that global health was a thing. So I suppose, like all good first generation children of parents from minority backgrounds, I wanted to be a doctor. I have yet to decipher whether that was entirely my desire or my mother's desire. 50-50 probably. Um, and that was the plan for a very long time. I studied my first degree at McMaster in the health sciences, and was on that path. But I did always have this thing where I was, if you look at my transcripts, there's always like a few classes that just didn't seem to make sense. So like I took European history from like 1700s to like the modernity, or another class around sort of like politics, and another one's about history of jazz. So I always had this really long standing sort of interest in social sciences and humanities that ran in parallel with my interest in science and the human body and health, and I suppose what makes us healthy, and also sort of our emotional well-being and our emotional lives, and how that is such a big part of what it means to be healthy. And so when I was studying, I would do all those courses, but I kept failing chemistry. And I suppose the rest of my life began when I failed organic chemistry, because that failure enabled me to really think about what else was out there. Like
Mhm.
there must be other things than going to medical school. What is it that those things are? And so I ended up flipping my major and my minor. So I was majoring in sort of biology and minoring in psychology, and so I flipped them, because I was really enjoying my psychology courses and talking about
Mhm.
like motivation, emotion, and sort of health psychology and all those different things. And so around that time, I sort of across my life, I also had a very sort of strong thread of an interest in social justice, and sort of was a big campaigner, at times for at my university for things like Amnesty International,
Mhm.
um, and sort of did different campaigns to raise funds for different organizations. And when I finished my degree, I did a trip, with uh, an organization that I cannot remember the name of, which is horrible. I think the World Youth Program, possibly. I can't remember. Anyway, we went on this trip, with about 20 other young people in our early 20s to Kenya. And the point of that trip was to sort of do work with different community organizations, helping them on existing projects that they had on. So we did two projects. We did one sort of eco environmental support project, and another one, that was doing support at an orphanage in the Rift Valley region. And this was sort of at the time when the HIV pandemic was quite full blown across most of the African continent, and you had really high levels of HIV orphans. And so when I was at that orphanage, I spent a lot of time with young children who'd lost both their parents or caregivers to, HIV and AIDS. And I started to think about what sort of how could we ensure the emotional well-being of children who sort of had that life story, how emotional well-being starts to interact with sort of the wider structural realities around young people's lives, around poverty and inequality and opportunities for education. And it was at that point that I realized what I really wanted to do was sort of look at health, but specifically mental health in the context of development, and sort of how these things all sort of fit together. And that's how I eventually sort of found global health, which I think at the time wasn't really talked of as global health. There weren't a lot of global health programs around. That's something that's really just sort of happened in the last decade or so. So now we're sort of talking about very early 2000s. And I sort of decide that that's basically what I want to do. And since I had already graduated, I did this, and I was sort of working as a in developmental disabilities with some young children. I did this thing where I went back to school, and I think it's really important to tell that part of my story, because I think we have this false idea that life pathways are quite linear, and I don't really think that's fair. And I sort of, I think a lot of the things that we learn about ourselves and where we want to be happen outside of those sort of straight paths, and then you often go back on yourselves. And so I went back on myself, and I went back to Mac, and I took 3 modules, and I was able to do that actually, skipping back a bit, because the first job I had after I graduated was working for a psychiatrist, and that psychiatrist, sort of, my grant ended, and so they let me go. And all of a sudden I was sort of like, I had this plan and I didn't really understand what I was going to do. I had been sort of thinking about Kenya and all that in the background, and I just sort of thought, well, that's what I wanted to do anyway. I didn't really want to be a psychiatrist anymore. That was an old path. I didn't really want to do that. So wherever he is now, I'm very grateful to him that he didn't move me onto another grant, and he just said, the funding for this project is up. It's been nice working with you. And at the time I was like, how could you? But if I met him again, I would say, thank you very much. I am who I am today because you made that decision. Um, and so I went back to school, and I went back to Mac, and I took international health promotion, which was an amazing class. It's absolutely amazing. And then I took 2 sort of women's studies classes, and those have nothing. Well, they maybe do, but anyway. So yeah, and it was there that I sort of just started looking for different programs. I found a program at the London School of Economics, which combined development and psychology and health. It was called Health Community Development. And I just sort of found it by accident. And I found, I'd never heard of the LSE before. I had no idea it was this big deal. So I just applied quite naively, and got in, and then basically moved to the UK in 2007, and then never came back. And since then have been sort of working very quite firmly in the global health space at the intersections of mental health and health promotion, and working with sort of communities to promote their own well-being through mobilization, and international development by sort of focusing on sort of those big structural realities that impact people's health. And so that's very much where I sit now. Um, yeah, but I really wouldn't have got there without first failing organic chemistry, and then that job sort of falling through unexpectedly about 6 months in. So yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think it's very important to always highlight the not so I guess great part that leads to like the bigger success. So thank you so much.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a success story, even though it had its ups and downs. And I think that's really important for like everyone watching to realize that if you're going through downs right now, it doesn't mean that you don't have success going forward. So
Mhm.
thank you for that. And I think the next question actually has to do a little bit more with those lows, and wondering if you had them. So, over the years, did you ever encounter any barriers to your success or growth as a Black female leader, and how did that impact your career?
I mean, well, I guess there's quite a few barriers, but it's always a strange and difficult thing to talk about, because I suppose in one way I feel that I've been very lucky, in the sense that I have never had somebody in my work environment express outwardly explicit anti-Black or racist comments towards me. But it doesn't mean that I don't exist within a system of structural barriers to my advancement. And I guess one of the first times I became aware of that was on my PhD, when I was doing my PhD. And one of the things is that, I was always the only Black woman in the room. And that happens a lot, I think, to sort of young women of color. They sometimes sort of are the only person in the room. And in a lot of ways, that takes it a toll psychologically, as you start to sort of think about the importance of belongingness. I suppose. And as something that we touched on before we started recording, this idea of representation and being seen. So I sort of had this experience and this reality at the LSE, which I used to call once upon a time the unbearable whiteness of being, because it was mostly a very white space. And so I felt the weight of that, and quite lonely sometimes because of it. I had amazing allies and advisors and supervisors, um, both white women who knew that and saw it, and in their work, their own work, did sort of anti-oppression and anti-racist work. And so within those spaces, that those safe spaces that they created for me, I never felt that way. I never felt unseen. But that's two rooms in a bubble of an entire institution. And I mean, like, I was there for about 5 years. Um, the first sort of, I did my PhD in 4 years, and then I had a year of teaching there. And you sort of go around and you're in rooms, and when I was teaching, oftentimes if I did teaching to large classrooms, there was never an assumption that I was the teacher. So I sort of had these sort of weird microaggressions, sort of at times being like, you know, if I had to talk to another instructor about something, they would always do that sort of thing where you're a bit confused when I say, look, I'm teaching next door, and then they do this physical like surprise at it. They just think they've been interrupted by a student. And I always said, well, I know I look young, but I'm not that young. So your confusion about this is about something different, and it's about the fact that there aren't a lot of Black women academics wandering around these big institutions in the UK teaching, researching, leading ideas. It's just not the case. In the UK, there's what, 35 Black professors in the whole country. In the whole country. So in going along this pathway to sort of to say that this is what I wanted to be, it felt lonely. And sometimes it still feels lonely, but not in the same way, because I think discourses are changing. And I think what the internet has done, which is sort of like, blown up in my lifetime, has sort of creates ways for you to make connections to other women in different sites and institutions who are sort of on similar journeys. And as I went through that, and sort of part of the question is sort of how did I handle that? When I decided that this is what I wanted to do, that I wanted to be an academic, I knew that I had to talk to other women who were doing the same thing that I was doing, or trying to do the same thing. And I was quite lucky to have a lot of people being willing to sort of like mentor me in that particular aspect of my life, and to sort of recognize and see and hear, what it's like to be a Black woman in academia in the UK. And I've been very lucky to be mentored by a handful of women who, I know that I can talk to at any time, who will sort of tell me, sort of like the hidden behind the scene things of what sort of people you want to avoid, and who is an ally. And sort of, you have to sort of do that sort of negotiation, because a big part of it is actually, and the saddest part of it actually, is coming to terms with the fact that not everybody has your best interests at heart. And so you have to try and anticipate that. And that sort of self-management is an important part of your work, but also an exhausting part of your work, because that's the hidden labor that people don't really talk about, how I managed my feelings the day that person sort of like talked about, me, or sort of made assumptions about me as in my capacity or ability to be a teacher, because of me being a Black woman coming to the door, or students sort of questioning my expertise or competence in ways that are likely linked to microaggressions. And that emotional labor of sort of talking yourself through those things and getting up and continuing to go another day is actually quite heavy. That's on top of the other labor of trying to be an academic, of publish or perish, or get that funding. You need to sort of win this amount of money in order to sort of be a leader in your field, you know, different metrics for success, applying for prizes, applying for fellowships, all these different things that are the everyday life of an academic. I then have to do those performing in anticipation of managing microaggressions linked to my gender and my race. And that is heavy, hard work. And that work never ends. And I think that that's probably, it's not necessarily a big down, but it's sort of the downside of what it means to stay where I am, if that's what you mean, if that makes sense.
Thank you so much. And honestly, I totally I can relate to what you said as well, because I didn't grow up here, but then when I moved here, even though I never experienced someone outrightly say racist things to me, I had to be aware of the microaggression and, sometimes question like, oh, why did this happen? Is it because I'm Black, or is it because this and that? Which I never had to do before in my own country, right? And it really saddens my heart, because even I came across a story of a woman that is a doctor, and she happens to be a Black doctor, and she also has dread. So,
Yeah.
there are assumptions. And then when she walks into the room, they're asking her, where is the doctor? And then she's like, I am the doctor. And then you have people questioning her, and it's just like, it really sucks that we still have to go through this, but I'm trying to be hopeful and know that with time, we'll get there one day. But
Yeah.
it's just the hard work of having to, prepare yourself for those possibilities. So, yeah, and which brings me to our next question, which is, in what way can emerging Black female leaders break barriers in their career?
Yeah, I think that's a really I think I think one of the things we have to acknowledge is that our very presence is already breaking a barrier, right? So, you know, there's a reason people still like sort of love that sweater that says, I am my ancestors' wildest dreams. Like every time you go into a space where you are the only person, that is a success that sort of comes off of a lineage of exclusion, and sort of the levels of exclusion differ across our different ethnic backgrounds and markers of difference. But you know when you show up to a room and you're in that room, that is a success, because you know every time somebody has an encounter with a with a person who is surprised to be there, that is a success, because you've broken their assumption of what that job is and who has the right to be in that role. Um, so, I mean, I think that celebrating those things as successes probably is what enables us to go on to have additional successes in our careers. Because if we don't acknowledge that, then people burn out. There's only so many times that you can, like, you know, for lack of a better word, weep over the same thing. So you have to also sort of see the other side of that encounter, and how that means something positive, in the sense that, you know, the next time that person goes into a room, they won't be as surprised to see a Black woman in front of the classroom, because they have seen it before. And it's that actually that knowledge and the recognition of the importance of that keeps me in academia personally. As I go through, and every year I see more and more Black women in my classrooms, and I sort of know, I you go from seeing one, and I'm sort of still sort of quite connected and close with her, and she sort of said to me, you have no idea what it means to see you at the front of a room, and so you stay. And in your career, you have to remember that. You have to remember it means something for people to see you where you are. That is a success. You are already succeeding. And the additional things that you do on top of that, in terms of like, um, breaking additional barriers or becoming a leader in whatever field you choose, um, they stem from that first moment that you step into the room and you are one of X number. Those things, they matter. And I guess the other thing for me, I would say, in order of how do people sort of become successful? Is that what you mean? Sort of like, how do you build successes? Yeah. Um, I would sort of say, find the thing that, and this sounds so cheesy, but find the thing that like makes you not feel like what you're doing is work. Sometimes that can be because it's a cause that you're passionate about. So for me, like, I think I'm so passionate about inequality and ending inequality in all of its forms, that I have essentially become a bit of, as my husband calls me, a cause junkie, that I can see the merit in every single cause. And sometimes that means I just take on too much work, because to me, anything that is trying to end inequality has value, and an immense value. But that has also contributed to my successes, because it means that at a relatively early stage in my career, I have done a lot of things, so I've sort of like followed things that are interesting, and supported them, and sort of made connections in places that, on paper wouldn't necessarily look like they fit, but in practice, in my heart, because I'm interested in, so passionate about and injustice, and ending inequalities, they fit for me. And so it opens up all these different windows and avenues and connections to new people and new organizations and collaborations, that I think has become a big marker of my own success, is that ability to sort of collaborate and work across disciplines and those types of things. I guess I would say, don't be afraid to fail. It sort of comes back to sort of where we started with your first question. How did you get where you are? Like, I got where I am because I failed something, and I failed at something. But really, you could also think of failure as practice. You could think of it as learning, because from every time something like that happened, you learn something new about yourself. So a lot of times, people who are very successful are often talked about as type A. They sort of go through life, and they always do everything right, and they've always got 100%, and they've always succeeded at everything. And I learned the most about myself when something goes wrong, because something has gone wrong, and you have to assess what went wrong, and you have to go through, you have to make sense of it. So it feels strange to say that I welcome failure, but when failure happens, I say, okay, now, so what next? And what does this have to teach me? And I think that has been good, but that's also something that I don't want to sort of create any misconceptions about. It is really hard. It's hard to learn from failure, because failure also hurts. We're human, and those things are hard. So, once you've given yourself enough time and emotional space to grieve over the hard thing that happened, and to feel it, then, always go back to your feedback and then those things a few days later, so you can have the opportunity to actually do the learning. You'll never do that learning the first time you get your rejection letter from a journal, or feedback on something that you've submitted, or a grant that gets rejected. You'll get the feedback, and you'll just be sad about it for 4 or 5, 6 days, however long you're going to be sad. Eventually, a space will open for you to learn about it, and you need to go back and look at those failures in order to learn from them. So I guess the last thing would be, don't be afraid of it, but like, make sure you fully process that failure, so you have the chance to learn.
Thank you so much. And I think that's a very important approach to take, because we are human and we're not perfect, and we are going to make mistakes, right? And it's important to be able to recognize that and be able to move pass from it, move from it, and learn from it if you need to. And what you said just reminded me of this saying that pretty much talks about how like our existence is resistance, right? And when you see a Black person in the room, it also opens up the possibility in the mind of a young Black female that is like, or even just a Black person that's just like, you know what, they're if they can do it, that means I can do it. There's a possibility that I can get there as well. So just recognizing that you being in the room in itself, you are breaking the barrier, right? And that's so important. So thank you so much for sharing that. And Tatiana, would you like to go ahead with next?
Yeah, I will. Just adding on to that, that's why representation is so important. And some people kind of dismiss that as just something people say. But representation means like mentoring from afar, the future generation, and kind of like breaking inequality through the generation. So that's why it's so important. So I agree with both of you in that. The next question, I actually wanted to go back for a second to when you said that there are a lot of female like mentors or leaders that helped you along the way. And we wanted to ask what kind of traits did these fellow either Black female leaders or just female leaders have that you admire that like makes them like leaders?
I guess the first thing would be they're always honest. They often say brutal honesty as a caveat before they say something. But I really respect that because I think there's so much difficulty in, I sort of talk about the extra labor of that hidden labor of microaggressions and all that stuff is very hidden. So I just think I think it's so inspiring and so important when women who get to a certain level in their career that they feel they have protection in order to be honest about things, are honest about things. And it sort of is something that I have taken on board and try to do in my own mentoring of young women is that I'm always honest, and sort of try and package that in sort of as much care and kindness as possible, because you can be honest without being cruel. And I think they were always honest and never cruel. And I really, appreciated that. Brutal honesty doesn't have to be a caveat for just being unkind to somebody. You can just tell somebody how it is and do that in a way that is loving and supportive and promoting. I suppose another thing that I've always admired about some of the amazing mentors that I've had is, I guess, is their ability to, despite being busy, never make you feel like you're being rushed away, if that makes sense. So really sort of being quite open and respectful and giving of themselves, despite the fact that they have so much on in any way, shape, or form, but they're very present in a moment, in the moment that they give you. So you feel that you're able to make those connections. And I guess another thing that sort of links back, the third and final thing that sort of links back to the first point about honesty, is sort of the way in which they talk about failure and struggle. And so being honest about what it takes for them to get where they are, and sort of saying, this is what I wanted to do, this is what I actually did, and that's totally okay. So creating lots of different ideas and pathways as options for you to see how to get somewhere. I think those would be the three things for me.
And thank you so much. And I have another question, which is just what advice do you have for a student wanting to pursue a similar career path? Or what advice would you give to your younger self?
I suppose if I was giving advice to my younger self, I would say the thing that you're doing in your spare time is probably the thing that you should try to give your time to. Because if you're sort of finding a way to do this despite everything else that's going on, what would happen if you gave all of your time to that? So really sort of look at again, at the things that bring you joy and make you feel like you want to get up in the morning, and see if you can find ways to figure that into what you do for a living. And then the other thing I guess I would say in terms of advice is don't try to be a hero, I guess, in the sense that um, and I touched on it earlier about the importance of collaboration, but really I sort of feel that working in the area that I work in, and this is particularly important for global health, in a context of huge inequalities between the spaces where global health is taught and delivered and the areas that global health work tries to be about, is that you cannot do the good work as an individual. And the good work for me is leaving the world a better place than what you found it in. You can only do that kind of work if you are working in collaboration, not just with peers at your institution, but the people on the ground that your work claims to be about. So you have an idea about how the world can be a better place. How does that idea fit with the ideas that the people who might be a recipient of a program have about what they want their life to be and the picture that they have about their lives? And how can you use the relative power and influence that you have in order to bring their visions of their life to fruition? So um, how can you work as an ally, um, in solidarity with the people that your work is about, so that it's not working on the lives of others or intervening in the lives of others, but working with others to improve a situation, a context, or an issue.
And what you said just took me back to one of my classes, like community development, and just how when you want to, like create an initiative or a program, you need to work hand in hand with the community, because they are the one that lives there and they know their issue, and you can't just come and just slap on like an initiative when you don't know their problem, right? And in order to even to be able to, I guess, create sustainable change or just like a permanent change, you need to address the root causes of the problem, right? And the only way you're gonna know that is when you work together with those people, right? And I love that you're all about that. And I was even reading like an article that you wrote about just being sometimes the only community psychologist in the room. And I just saw how you were thinking about how you took into consideration like other factors that will come in play. And I think that's very important. So
Moving forward, we did want to ask something as well in terms of what you consider to be your biggest professional achievement to date in your career. What would you say that is?
Last year, well, actually 2019 into 2020, I collaborated with a psychosocial support organization in South Africa called Pola. And Pola is this organization that delivers psychological support programs for men, women, and children who live in South Africa, in the Johannesburg area, around contexts and living through contexts of adversity, so violence, poverty, um, various sort of impacts of sort of racial and economic inequality that people face in that country. And through funding from the Knott and Clift Matthews Fund, which is run through the Institute for Global Health, we were able to fund a pilot project of an intervention called Courage. And we did a pilot with the Courage intervention, and we added, which is a sort of 9-week counseling intervention that is built on storytelling and sort of women coming together to sort of tell their life stories, but to also tell them through lenses of survival as opposed to suffering, and wanted to understand the impact of this type of intervention on people's mental health. And so we also, in this pilot study, we ran that intervention, but added a plus package. And that was 4 additional sessions where women were also given the opportunity to develop strategies for tackling social determinants of their distress, so poverty, was the biggest one facing these women's lives. And so it's about 13 weeks. 50 women participated in this intervention, and we had really amazing results where we sort of looked at rates of depression that fell from sort of moderately severe levels and moderate levels of depression um, to zero. So, sort of having no symptoms of depression by the end of the intervention, which is particularly special because usually you'll see big drops in sort of symptoms when you participate in counseling interventions. But um, our findings showed that when you add that booster package of sessions to give people an opportunity to imagine a new way of life or ways out of things like poverty, then that sort of dropped symptoms of depression to zero. And so we had this really successful pilot and a graduation ceremony for all the women in March of 2020 in South Africa. And when I went to the graduation ceremony, I got to see some of the women. I had met some of them while they were doing the intervention, but then I also got to go back and meet all of them at their graduation. And they just sort of all told stories about how much the intervention meant to them and how it had changed their lives. And some of the women have started up their own NGOs, which they sort of developed within that program. And so it was a really sort of a culmination of a lot of things that I'd worked on over many years in terms of trying to think, how do we get the way that we think about treatment for health to match what people ask us for, which is treatment for the ill societies that they live in and the ill societies that drive poor health. And, we have this model of an intervention that looks really promising at getting us closer to that in some ways. And so that felt really, really special to me, to be able to sort of see something like that come to fruition, but also to be able to, like I said earlier, sort of leverage the power and resources that I have access to as an academic in sort of a rich country with interest in these types of spaces to have impactful and meaningful change in the lives of these 50 women in the pilot. And so I sort of really strongly believe in action research or intervention research, which is changing things as we go to try and find solutions. So that would be something that I think is really special. And yeah.
Great. Thank you so much for that. And we've come to the last question for today. So, of course, we've talked about a lot of important things today throughout the interview. And what would you say then is the takeaway that our members should get from today? Something that you want them to kind of remember and take with them going forward?
I guess the sort of I like to do things in three. So I'll sort of think about those big three takeaways is to find the thing that gets you up in the morning and try to make your work about that as much as possible, because that way it will it will drive you through the hard bits that much more easily. To remember that your existence is resistance, right? That when you show up, you succeed just by virtue of you being there is a success. Um, and and finally, I suppose, to if the aim is to leave the world in a better place than you found it, or to leave something behind, then in order to do that, you should think about how you leverage and mobilize the power that you have to enable change in other spaces. And sort of, yeah, always think about what does your work leave behind. And I think that way sort of happiness and satisfaction lies.
Thank you so much. That was beautiful. Like, wow. I'm so excited right now because I'm just like, I don't know, I feel like my mind is just like, and like, I just see possibilities. And like, I don't know, when you just even mentioned like how you consider other factors and it's not just like, okay, do this, do that. And it's like, no, let's consider other contributing factors and how we can work from that and just build from there and go from there. I don't know. It's just like, I don't know. It's getting me excited. I'm like, oh gosh, I hope I'm able to I don't know, create change someday. Well,
Yeah.
I'm on the path to, well, I'm excited for the future. Yeah, thank you
Yeah.
so much.
Yeah, and thank you so much for joining us today. And it was a pleasure to be with you here today, for you to take the time and for, leaving these words for our members. Thank you so much.